Rick Carney, coordinator of the Great Basin LCC. For those of you who may be new to the LCC, we are a partnership among public and private groups that are working together to meet large-scale conservation challenges across the 5-state Great Basin ecoregion. We have supported a variety of conservation science projects on high-priority topics. This series highlights a few of these projects. We hope that these webinars can provide a platform for discussion about the research and its application in the Great Basin. We will keep today's presentations relatively short, about 30 minutes, and reserve the second half of the hour for questions and discussion with our researcher. Since there are a lot of folks on the webinar, actually more than 200 at this point, we ask that you type in your questions as they arise. We will read out these questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website in a day or so. On your screen, you'll notice a small collapsed control panel in the upper right corner. By clicking on the small arrow button, you'll be able to expand the control panel. In this expanded control panel, you can send in your questions. Simply type your question into the chat area near the bottom and press send. The question will be sent to us to respond to at the end of the webinar. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jason Dunham. Dr. Dunham is a research aquatic ecologist at the USGS's Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center, located in Corvallis, Oregon. He also holds a graduate faculty appointment in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Oregon State University. His research interests include landscape ecology of aquatic ecosystems, conservation biology of focal species, ecology of natural disturbance, biological evasions, and monitoring. Dr. Dunham holds a PhD in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology, as well as a Master's of Science in Zoology and a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology. Prior to his appointment with the USGS, he served as a research fisheries biologist with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, Idaho. Take it away, Jason.
Rick, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for listening in today. This is a really important project for me, and I'm really privileged to have so much interest in this topic. I want to thank all of the partners that we have in this effort from the outset. I'm not going to be able to name too many individual names in the time that I have from all these organizations, but you can see all the logos at the top. Really takes a village, so to speak, to pull this kind of work off. It's not easy. And before we get into talking about the details of how we're studying streamflow permanence and thermal regimes in Great Basin streams and beyond, I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of the importance of stream classifications for just about everything that we do. And when I mention stream classifications, I'm talking about streams that are classified as perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral in the National Hydrography data set. These classifications drive a host of regulations and land uses ranging from the Clean Water Act compliance, which most of you are familiar with. It's been in the news quite a bit in the past few years, and all of that has sort of cascading implications for land treatments, where you can apply pesticides, where you can, where and how you can fight fires, timber harvest, streamside buffers, grazing, groundwater use, and so many other activities that really have very important ecological and economic implications. Part of the challenge with stream classifications is they're often incorrect, and it's really not a mistake on anyone's part. These were determined decades ago, and we simply just don't have the resources anymore like we used to when we were initially creating these maps. The NHD was initially drawn by hand on pen and paper using stereo maps. So We just don't have those kinds of resources these days. Another reason that sometimes you'll find that the stream classifications are not right for you is they're not climate sensitive. They were determined decades ago. And just an example study here on the right-hand side of this slide. This is recent work by Ken Fritz and others from EPA, looking here actually in the state of Oregon where I'm at. They found that the NHD classifications of permanence agreed with field classifications about 50% of the time. So that's your cup half full, or you can say that they're off by about 50% of the time. And we'll see how that works for some of the streams that we're studying in the Great Basin I'll discuss today. Another challenge with stream classifications is they're pretty simplistic. You have three types of streams, and we know there's a lot going on out there in terms of different patterns of stream flows or temperatures for that matter. So we can think about temperature or flow or other continuous phenomena in terms of regimes. Regimes are characterized by the timing of events, their duration, how long they last, their frequency, how many times they occur, and their magnitude in the case of temperature, how warm for how long, how many times, those sorts of things. That's what we're sort of moving towards for these types of parameters, is to describe them in terms of regimes, and that means that we need continuous data through time. And we also know that these regimes are really variable in space. And on the right-hand side here is just an image, a little bit blurry image from some great work by Chris Yeager and her colleagues working on the Verde River Basin in central Arizona, looking at changes in stream flow permanence regimes. This was published in PNAS in 2014, and they projected this with climate models to look at how spatial patterns of stream drying were affecting threatened and endangered fish in this particular watershed. Very compelling work, and really making the case that we need to think about this in terms of regimes, and we need to be very spatially explicit. Finally, a lot of us on the call probably are fisheries and wildlife biologists, are interested in ecological conservation issues, and in the Great Basin, water is very important for water obligates like fish and amphibians, and indeed they are the region's most imperiled taxa. They are the only ones that are, to my knowledge, that are listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. I might have missed something there, but for the species that have been proposed for listing, like the greater sage-grouse, mountain quail, pygmy rabbit, and others, if you look at models in the literature and the models that are trying to explain where you find these animals across that landscape, the variable distance to water usually explains a lot of where you find them and where you don't. And we also know that climate change is driving water availability now. Everybody's heard about the California drought. It's really not the California drought, it's a regional drought. It's extended into Nevada. It's sort of turning off and on and manifesting itself in different places and different forms throughout the West. And in the future, as things get warmer, regardless of what happens with precipitation, we're going to see more droughts. Okay, so that's my background, and I'm going to keep it kind of brief here on the 3 lines of work, just so you understand what we're doing and some preliminary results from that work, and then leave most of the time for question and answer from the audience. So the first of our 3 lines of work is direct quantification of regimes. And this means actually physically putting instruments into stream channels to quantify that pattern of year-round flow permanence and temperature. And we've been conducting these studies at regional and individual focal basin extents. The second of these 3 lines of work is based on use of one-time so-called found observations of whether or not a particular stream was wet or dry at the time of sampling. So it's not based on continuous data. It's a grab sample of found observations. So we've been assembling data sets from across the Pacific Northwest, including parts of the Great Basin, to look at that. The third line of work, which is something that we're just getting into, we submitted a big proposal to NASA to get this work going, is to make use of citizen-driven data collection. It's a pretty exciting direction to go. I'll talk about that at the end and give you a sense of where we're going to go with that. So for the first line of work, direct quantification, this work is focused in the Great Basin. I've been working there as a fish ecologist for a better part of 3 decades, and have really come to realize that we need to know about water if we're going to understand fish, and coming to grips with the fact that our knowledge of water is not that great. We are sampling at regional extents where we have more widely distributed sensors and streams. You can see a picture of the eastern Lahontan Basin. This is out in north central Nevada, and the points there are grits points. It's a way to sort of statistically draw a sample, probabilistic sample from a big extent. So that's going on. I'm not going to talk about that today because we just started the sampling in the Lahontan Basin and also in the Oregon Lakes Basins in southeast Oregon, that northwest part of the Great Basin. I just started that this year, so we don't have results. But we do have results from the first of our focal basins that we have studied starting a couple years back. So this is the Willow and Whitehorse Basin here in southeast Oregon. Go into detail there. We also have some ongoing work here in another Willow Creek, lots of Willow Creeks in the Great Basin, the Willow Rock Basin here in north central Nevada. So our focus in Willow-Whitehorse Creek in southeast Oregon initially was on the 2012 Holloway fire. It was a massive fire that spread across northern Nevada, southeast Oregon, burned a huge acreage, and big concern for landowners and land managers in that part of the world. And they were very concerned about how it influenced water quality, namely stream temperatures. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. Of course, the drought really started to magnify in 2015. So I will give you a picture there of how that influenced flows and temperatures in this particular watershed. I'll talk about the accuracy of stream classifications and see how they pan out relative to that work by Ken Fritz and others, and show you the implications of these changes for a threatened fish. It's Lahontan cutthroat trout. This particular basin is the world's stronghold for the species. It's one of the biggest watersheds that it is still left in. It's been managed really well with a really good partnership between the ranchers and land managers there in the region. Been going on for many years. In the future, we're going to take this work a little bit further. We've got some remotely sensed information on riparian zones to take a look at time series of changes in riparian zones and how those link to changes in the stream itself, and have to save that for a future webinar because I haven't quite gotten there yet. Here's a closer look at the Willow-Whitehorse Basin. You can see the triangles distributed across those stream lines, the stream network here. It's a pretty good sized network. You can see the scale bar there on the bottom. Highlighted here are 4 locations that we sampled. We had temperature loggers in before the Holloway fire burned this watershed. So in these 4 places, we actually have pre and post-fire water temperatures. And finally, if you take a look at the dotted line around the outside of this basin, that is the outline of the Holloway fire itself, which happened in August of 2012. Look on the right-hand side, that's an immediate picture right after the fire. It kind of gives you a sense of what happened there. Things look pretty toasty, pretty major change in the uplands and the riparian zone. Here's kind of a nutshell slide. We have a manuscript that's drafted and in review right now with the co-authors describing this and some other things that I'm going to be talking about here in a few minutes. But here's a nutshell of what happened during that Holloway fire. You can see the vertical kind of a purplish bar there indicating when the fire was swept through the basin. I've got a red line indicating maximum daily water temperatures, black line indicating mean water temperatures, and the green indicating minimums for those particular days. And indeed, you see right after the fire, particularly the maximum temperatures really shot up a few degrees, reflecting that loss of riparian cover and increased solar radiation, most likely. So we've tracked this out over the 3 years since the Holloway fire, and what we found statistically in a nutshell is the influences of that particular fire are largely non-detectable after 2 years, which was really neat for us to see. I've done work in other forested landscapes looking at fires and water temperatures, and sometimes those effects can persist for more than a decade. So pretty interesting here. Didn't last too long, at least at those 4 sites where we had pre-post fire information. Of course, once the fire effects subsided in 2014, the drought, the regional drought, started to kick in full force. Not very good news in terms of keeping water temperatures cold or streams wet. This is just a picture from that drought monitor that most of us probably take a look at on occasion, and showing so that maximum extent of the regional drought in 2015, and kind of how things were looking this winter. Still in a severe drought condition within the study area that I'm talking about now. So what happened during the 2015 drought? Did temperatures warm? The answer here is yes, maybe, and no. So a little bit of everything. And what we have here is a map of the streamlines in the Willow-Whitehorse Basin. Those are colored according to norwest predictions of mean August stream temperatures. Norwest is a regional model of mean August stream temperatures. It's available for most streams in the west, gridded out at 1 kilometer intervals. Laid on top of the norwest lines are the points that we sampled water temperature at in 2015. And here we're looking at deviations between norwest, which is developed between 1993 and 2011, just prior to the Holloway fire. We're looking at those temperatures that average over that time period relative to what we saw in 2015. You can see some places are hot, some places look pretty similar, and other places actually look a little bit colder. Here's an easier way to sort of digest all of that information. So here we're looking at the deviation on the y-axis of this graph on the left-hand side. On the x-axis, we're just looking at points arranged by their deviation from negative to positive. First thing to note here is of the 102 sites that we sampled, 54 were dry. They had no water whatsoever. Of the remaining sites, we saw that 13 were actually colder during the drought, and 35 sites were warmer during the drought relative to that norwest baseline. And to make a little more sense of this pattern, if you look at this deviation again, same thing on the y-axis, but now on the x-axis we have elevation, so going from low elevations up to the mountaintops. And you can see as we get higher up in the watershed, we tend to find that, interestingly, that during this drought, during this hot, dry spell, these streams are actually colder than we'd expect, although most streams are warmer than we'd expect down low. And there's a lot of possible explanations for this. Maybe a smaller flow path with less water in the streams during a drought, less exposure to solar radiation, and most certainly a greater contribution of groundwater during this drought in 2015 in those sites that got cooler. So pretty interesting stuff, pretty heterogeneous response to drought. Never would have thought about that unless I collected the data and saw it myself. In terms of stream classifications, this is just a matrix showing what we expected to find based on the NHD coverage in terms of perennial and intermittent streams, and what we actually found in the field as wet or dry. So anything that's classified as perennial, we would have expected to find wet, because perennial means flowing all throughout the year. And we did find 51 wet streams, but we also found 22 perennial streams that were bone dry. So pretty similar to the results that Ken Fritz got in other systems in this region. There's a lot of room for improvement of stream classifications. And this is in September 2014, before the drought sort of reached its full expression. So those streams should have been, they should have had water in them, but they didn't. In terms of intermittency for NHD, most of the streams that were classified as intermittent were dry, which is something we would expect at the time of year that we're out there, which is late summer. So no surprises there. Final question here for this study: what about the trout? Like I mentioned earlier on, this is the world's stronghold for this species, threatened species, the hunt and cutthroat trout. You can see the stream network here again. If you look real close, you can see that some lines are thicker, some of those blue lines are thicker. Those are the places where we expect trout to be present based on the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's classification of this network. So we're just going to take a look now at stream temperatures within the distribution of this species. And what we find overall, once again, there's quite a bit of drying in this drought year. About a third of those streams are completely dry, so don't need to worry about temperature there. Also, most of these points are above the standard, the Oregon standard for protecting the species, the cold water standard. So that means that most of these sites are in places where you may be more likely to observe physiological stress during this time period. Only those dark blue points in this watershed are places that are below the standard. You can see just a handful of these sites during the drought. This is really remarkable to me, to see such a dramatic contraction of suitable habitat during just 1 year. Like I mentioned before, this habitat here is as good as it gets for this species, and it's extremely sensitive to changes in climate. Okay, future directions. You know, we're going to continue sampling these focal basins. We just got a new shot of funding to continue our work in north central Nevada. We're going to try to keep it going in Willow-Whitehorse creeks. Every year is an interesting new lesson for us. And we're expanding to take a look at a regional extent to incorporate this whole landscape of the Northwest Great Basin to learn about water availability and water quality. We'd like to not only look at trout, but to try to incorporate other sensitive species into the results that we're getting, and hoping to do a little bit of that this winter through some workshops with the LCC to incorporate those terrestrial species like the greater sage-grouse and aquatics like spotted frogs and trout, of course, other species into these assessments, and making better use of this new information that's coming out. I mentioned in the future that we're going to take a more detailed look at riparian in-stream connections in collaboration with Trout Unlimited, who's done a lot of the remote sensing for us in Willow and Whitehorse creeks. And then that regional data set is going to give us a better picture of climate sensitivity, how flow permanence and thermal regimes respond to variation in climate among years. And finally, of course, to develop stronger management partnerships with all of this information that's so important for everything that we do. The second line of work I want to turn to is something that's just in its early stages, so I don't have as much to say about this, and even less about the third line of work. So there will be some time for discussion here, don't worry. But this is a use of one-time or found observations. This project is what we call the Headwater Intermittency Prediction Study. It's a big collaboration between multiple USGS centers in the region, and also Trout Unlimited, Dan Dualter, they're in Reno, working together. We've got geographers, hydrologists, remote sensing specialists, and a couple of token ecologists, myself and Dan, working on this. And the main sort of mover and shaker in this effort is Roy Sando, who's our geographer in Helena. He's really been doing a lot of work sort of leading this effort, but everyone is playing their part. For short, we call this the HIP study. So that's easy to remember. The main questions we have here are where, when, and why do headwater streams go dry in the Northwest? What are the causes of headwater stream intermittency, and how do they vary across ecoclimatic regions in this landscape, including big portions of the Great Basin? And what can we determine based on this information about future headwater stream status in the Northwest? We've talked a lot about water temperature and stream flow at downstream gauges and looking at climate change effects in this region, but what if we lose streams altogether? And small streams are more than 2/3 of the total network of any stream network, so these are things to be concerned about. So in addition to all the data that we're harvesting across the region, which I'll show you here in a second, we need good predictors to explain why some streams have water and other ones don't. And based on recent work by Roy Sando and Kyle Blasch, two of the PIs in this effort, we know that remotely sensed measures of snowpack persistence, how long it persists into the summer season, surface geology, which influences permeability and runoff, and mean air temperatures. These three factors do a pretty darn good job of telling us what's wet and what's dry. And we're trying to add a host of other remotely sensed predictors you can see here on the slide as a part of this effort. And several folks involved in this collaboration are busy putting these together right now as I speak. The other thing we're doing is trying to make use of existing data. We realize this is just a one-time look at a stream, and yeah, you can't step in the same stream twice. We've known that for thousands of years, but trying to put as much existing data on the table as possible. It's expensive to do the kind of work that we do in Nevada with instruments and people and time. So try to use as much of the existing information as is available. These are just some examples of some of the data sets that we've been pulling together. It's a subset, and there's a lot more than this going on. And here's just a regional map of how it's starting to come together, and you can see that we've been able to harvest literally thousands of points, and particularly in Oregon and the state of Washington, there's going to be a lot more filling in there in the future, including this portion of the Great Basin down here. Here's an example of what this tool will look like. It's essentially model predictions. This is from a recent paper, which you can go check out on your own by Roy and Kyle, published 2015. And here they have a map of the lower Clark Fork where they have the observed stream status in terms of perennial or intermittent mapped out, and then their predicted stream status based on the model. And this is kind of the same thing that we've been doing in Willow-Whitehorse Creek and many other places. The good news here is we're expanding this from the extent of the lower Clark Fork to the entire Northwest. Future directions here, like I mentioned, develop that regional tool to update our stream classifications and predict intermittency during the late summer time period. We know streams go dry during other times of the year, but we just don't have that continuous data like we do with the instrumental data sets, so going to restrict our inferences to late summer. We're going to validate those predictions, however, against continuous data like that we have in Willow-Whitehorse creeks, just to see how well our models perform against that full year perspective. With these data in hand, because many of the predictors we're using are climate sensitive, like snowpack and air temperature, we can take a stab at projecting climate effects to take a look at which streams may likely go dry in the future as things get warmer and precipitation changes here in the region. A final important component of this study is to revise estimates of suitable habitat for key species. And we decided in this project to focus on two groups of focal species. In Northwest forests, we're going to take a look at the bull trout vulnerability assessment, which is a project that I'm leading there to see how we can revise our estimates of suitable habitat and climate vulnerability. Same thing in the Great Basin Desert. We've got big data sets and models of suitable habitat in place for red band and Lahontan cutthroat trout, and try to take a look at the entire range of those species and see how well we're doing based on this new classification of streams. So very exciting stuff. The final, the third of the 3 lines of work is something fairly new for me. It's citizen-driven data collection, and this is something that's based off of smartphones. I teach courses at various universities, most recently at Oregon State, and when we do field classes, I usually tell students to put their smartphones away. As of this year, I'm asking them to take their smartphones out. They've really become amazing tools, and I'll tell you why here in a second. This is in the proposal phase, although I will say we've had a wonderful connection with national parks, and just a few folks here listed from NPS who have played an important role in helping me to advance this work, and then some of my colleagues in USGS like Chris Yeager at the Washington Water Science Center, Kyle Blosch in Idaho. We even have a almost bona fide rocket scientist, Cedric David, who works at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and Christian Torgerson in our research group here in Frusk. The one statistic that really kind of drew me into this effort was the contrast in the number of employees that we have in national parks across the country. It's only 22,000 folks running all of those national parks that we value and enjoy. But in those parks, they have 220,000 volunteers. So an order of magnitude more folks just helping for free. Then check that out, 300 million visitors in 2015 to national parks. So a massive potential workforce available to help us track streamflow in these parks. So what we're doing is building a smartphone application that's similar to iNaturalist, which some of you may be familiar with. iNaturalist is a photo capture software where you can go out and take pictures of creatures. It gets automatically loaded up to a geodatabase, and you can answer a couple questions. Those answers to the questions also go into that geodatabase. And iNaturalist has had pretty amazing success in the short time that it's been around. You can see this slide in the center bottom of this, or this image in the center bottom of this slide. They've managed to amass over 2 million observations of biota across the planet just using these smartphones and volunteers. And there's some other smartphone apps that have been developed, like Creek Watch, which I think is no longer really functional, to try to track conditions in streams. And we want to build on a platform like Creek Watch, like iNaturalist, to allow visitors and volunteers in national parks to track patterns of streamflow permanence at stream channel, trail crossings, or wherever they show up in a national park just with their phone. And we're hoping to get hundreds of thousands of observations on that as a result of this effort. Here's just one example. You know, we're proposing to put together this streamflow permanence app. Here's an example of how iNaturalist at least worked for me. As I was writing this proposal, I was walking out in a local park, and I happened to find a sharp-tailed snake, which is a fairly rare thing to see. It's actually the first one I've seen in my life, so I pulled out my phone. I downloaded iNaturalist. I took a picture of the snake, uploaded it. That whole process took me about 10 minutes. I went back to my computer the next day and found that my observation was listed here on iNaturalist's site. And there was somebody in the user community that took a look at my picture and told me that I identified it correctly, which of course I knew that I did. But always nice to get confirmation. So a really cool thing, and it was neat for me to collect the data and immediately see my results posted on the web and get some interaction from folks in the user community. So very neat tool. And working with the parks is an essential component of this. You know, national parks are fairly intact places, often in those latitudes or elevations where you're seeing dramatic effects of climate. For example, Glacier National Park is one of the sort of poster examples of climate change. And the parks have been great. They have a very strong interpretive program as well as a natural resources program that we're working with, and they formally adopted iNaturalist for their centennial this year to conduct what we call bio blitzes, and they've done these blitzes throughout all of the units in the national park system, and amassed tens of thousands of new observations, including many species that have never been recorded in parks, just using iNaturalist and citizen scientists. So I'm pretty excited about the possibility of conducting a drought blitz or some sort of Streamflow permanence blitz. That doesn't sound quite as good as drought blitz, but something like that in national parks to get that data that we need so badly. So this is a proposal. It's in with NASA because we're making heavy use of their remotely sensed products like we are in the other two lines of work for this effort I'm talking about here. And we're interested in trying to understand more about factors that drive citizen participation using these sorts of tools. They don't work unless people use them. So that's a big part of it. So we've got folks who are very experienced in natural resource interpretation and outreach helping there. We have questions about the quality and quantity of information and how to sort of adjust citizen science data so that we know it reflects what's happening in reality. So we're going to couple citizen data collection with instrumental data collection to come up with some statistical ways of correcting that citizen science data. Like I said, links to NASA satellite products. There's so many things we can use to predict streamflow statistically or by using hydrologic models, so physical process-based models. And all this has a ton of value for modeling climate sensitivity and looking at how our streams are expanding or contracting in the face of climate change. And what I like to say is we're trying to take the hydrologic pulse of national parks in this effort. So we'll see where that goes. In closing, I want to have a big shout out to all of our partners. Again, this is a really hard work. This is just one site in the Great Basin. One of our partners, Todd Alai, I went down there with him to deploy instruments here, and we hiked out literally to that ridgetop to get that one data point. So this work is not always that easy, but lots of folks see the value in it, and I greatly appreciate that. I'll cut it off there. I've already gone too long, but there are the three aspects of this study, 3 lines of work, and open it up for questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jason. That was very interesting. Yes. Go ahead, Liz.
Yes, I was just going to say we've got lots of questions that have been coming in throughout the presentation, and I'll just remind folks that if you have additional questions, you can use the control panel by clicking on that red arrow on your screen, and that will let you type in your questions. And so we'll try and get through as many of these as we can, because like I said, there's quite a few that have come through. So Jason, I'm just going to start here with the first one that we got, which was in that surface water constitutes less than 1% of the total water contained within a watershed. Was there any effort to correlate surface water and groundwater relationships? Specifically, was there any collection of groundwater thermal changes?
Right. That's a really good question. It's a big issue in the Great Basin, and that's something that requires us to communicate with our colleagues who are working in that groundwater arena. Also, looking at those spatial patterns of gaining and losing of flow, as well as the thermal regimes, can inform us about places where we can predict more or less groundwater influence. So first things first, trying to figure out what's going on the surface, and yes, the next step is to start looking below, and that is an important step this winter for us, and some of these workshops and other things that we're doing is to connect more with groundwater hydrologists. And in fact, we've got a couple of them working with us on the HIP study, for example. So yeah, good question.
Great. And another one from a little bit earlier in the presentation was, are there any net changes in the demographics for the study areas? Examples being building or well permits?
Yes. You know, that's a, because this has such important implications for land use and that sort of social human landscape, whatever you want to call it, I think that's something we could take a look at in the future. We certainly have information on like the distribution of center pivots and human developments, and that's something I think that can be linked to these patterns of water availability in the future as these data start to roll in. And sort of the same answer I'd have with groundwater. You know, this is the one sort of missing piece in the equation. This is something you can't quantify from space. You really have to get it on the ground. That's why we don't have it. And so I'm hoping that will come together.
Great, thank you. Next question here is, Jason, have you or anyone else done a comparison of measured versus predicted stream temperatures at a similar scale in another system that hasn't experienced a burn? And following with that, how much deviation is there in those systems?
Yeah, I can't answer the second half off the top of my head, but we have, and you know, Norwest is a good model. It was created, you know, for a specific time frame, and oftentimes, and it's with the data they had on hand, you know, when the model was created. And it's not unusual to find deviations between Norwest and other measurements. They're usually not super extreme, but sometimes you know, more than a couple of degrees. It's not a big surprise. I think even to the folks, you know, who really led in putting that together, I think it's a great effort. And another question we get is, you know, can we do more than just August and more than just a mean? Absolutely. And lots of folks are beginning to do that now. And I think, you know, one of the biggest values of Norwest is it kind of throws those values out there for you to look at and to question and to try to improve, just like NHD. Just like the work that we're doing. So I guess the overall answer is yes.
Great. And we have two questions here that are both about the Willow-Whitehorse system, so I'm going to group these together. The first one is just wondering if there were beaver in the system. And then the next one is, within that whole watershed, is there any interest in examining the impact of active restoration on the persistence and temperature of water there?
Yeah, yeah, there are beaver in there, and that they really came in after the riparian zone improved following the improvements in land management as a result of that Trout Creek Mountains Working Group forming, and it's really amazing what happened to that landscape over the last 20 years. I've been working down there. Beavers have done wonderful things for wetlands. They're some of the places that didn't burn as severely in the Holloway fire. So there's lots of potential benefits. We're curious now with the data that we're collecting to see how upstream beaver dam complexes and reservoirs influence late season low flows as well as stream temperatures. In some cases, beaver ponds can improve that surface-subsurface connection and cool stream flow. Some people have found that. And others can actually warm water temperature. We've seen that in the Great Basin and some other places. So super important question. The other thing that we did carefully in distributing these samples in this study was to try to get them inside and outside of historical grazing exposures. So that's somewhat of an active means of trying to improve the riparian zone, and we'll be taking a look at that down the road, particularly in relation to the next step in that study, looking at connections between remotely sensed riparian conditions, that's with the NAPE imagery, the 1 meter square resolution imagery shot once a year, and connecting that to what's happening in the stream itself.
All right, great. Next question for you here is, are there any problems with non-native or invasive fish with temperature water increases?
Absolutely. Yeah, in some of these systems there are warm water introduced fish. Probably the most notorious are some of the non-native catfishes and centrarchids, so things like bluegills and bass, and they definitely do great in warm water and have pretty can have some pretty important impacts on cold water species, not only replacing them but actively displacing mostly through predation. Has been sort of the evidence that we have so far.
All right, great. And another one here, can the cold water temperatures at elevation be attributed to increased rate of snowmelt?
The warmer water could be, now I'm not a hydrologist, I might get myself in a little bit too deep here, but you know, sometimes that connection between snowmelt and runoff can be pretty complex, but thus far in the HIP project, at least some of the earlier papers that motivated that work, we found some pretty simple and transferable relationships between that persistence of snowpack and probability of being wet in late summer. But we also realized there are lots of things going on in watersheds that can't be simply captured in a statistical model like HIP or like Norwest. So like in the NASA study, for example, with the citizen science component, we do have two people, Chris Yeager and Cedric David, there working on rainfall runoff process-based models to you know, give us that kind of perspective. So we're hoping to address that question in much more detail in future work.
Okay, great. So there's a handful of questions here related to the citizen science project. One is that, is there a possibility of expanding that to include other agencies? And then kind of similar, is there any interest in adjusting the focus to taking the hydrogeologic pulse of the national parks?
Yeah, I love that project. If we do get it funded, you know, for me, national parks really seem like the place to start. I have good relationships with them already, and the folks there are just amazingly enthusiastic. But the tools that we develop are not going to be limited to applying just in parks themselves. You know, for example, one of my fantasies as an old retired guy, is to be walking the Pacific Crest Trail, taking the hydrologic pulse, maybe the hydrogeologic pulse of the whole trail. So that's a lot of land ownerships, but we could do this anywhere. It's a tool that kids could use in the classroom. It's a tool that you know, suitable even for adults. There are great groups like Adventures for Science, Master Naturalist programs, all kinds of places this could go. It just made sense, you know, in terms of marketing and initial application to start with the parks, since they have that great experience with iNaturalist. So, yep, everywhere.
Great. I can hear about existing data. So is there any reason you are not using national wetlands inventory data as existing data?
Nope. We could. You know, we'd have to get our hands on that. I got my email up here on the screen, so send me an email, and we'll try to, you know, we've got another few weeks before we're going to close that data set. But like this other work, the HIP tool is something that can be continuously updated over time. So yes, the more the merrier.
Great. There's still quite a few questions coming in, so I'm going to try and get through as many of these as we can. The next one here for you is that you mentioned that changes in flow sources and incoming radiation may both be responsible for changes in observed August stream temperatures. How have you worked to tease apart these controls?
We haven't. It's been a ton of work just to collect these data, but it opens the door to that type of inquiry down the road. You know, that'd be something where you'd need to use a heat budget model and maybe looking at radiometers and tracking actual discharge, surface, subsurface flux to, you know, quantify all the components of the heat budget of a stream. And no, we have not done that yet. It's pretty challenging for small streams, but you know, seeing that heterogeneity, I think, is sort of the first step to thinking in more complex ways about the actual, you know, processes that are playing out in the landscape and creating that heterogeneity, which is the only reason we have fish left in the stream that we're looking at.
All right. Have there been any collaboration efforts with the USDA's Reynolds Creek experimental watershed, specifically per land use and thermal regulation?
Yeah, there's been some discussion. Had some folks who've worked out there give talks in some of the sessions we've held at different meetings, and I think Reynolds Creek is a wonderful laboratory for trying to understand the processes, maybe from the same person that asked that previous question. So I think you know, there's definitely always more that can be done there, and I think those kinds of places are great for, you know, kind of really drilling down into the process. And what we're trying to do here is zoom out to a couple orders of magnitude bigger in terms of scale and looking at patterns and sort of that groundwork for you know, broad-scale conservation assessments.
All right. And going back here to the Willow-Whitehorse watershed, did anyone look at the quantity and responses of aquatic species both pre and post-fire in that watershed?
No, a little bit of surveys here and there, but not really, you know, rigorous enough to quantify that response. We've done that kind of work in other places, and in my experience, what really matters is not so much the demographics, but the size of the habitat, the size and connectivity, so that landscape pattern is what's driving where you see fish like Lahontan cutthroat trout in the landscape or not. We do have a separate NASA study funded to look at demography of Lahontan cutthroat trout in more detail, and those publications will be coming out in 2017. We're basically taking a time series of fish abundance from multiple streams and linking rates of intrinsic increase and carrying capacity to remotely sensed variables, and using sort of a Bayesian multi-level modeling framework to interpolate population dynamics across the whole region. It's pretty far out stuff, but so far those models surprisingly seem to be working really well. So stay tuned. That'll be coming out next year.
Okay. This next question here, I'm going to go ahead and apologize because I think I'm going to butcher a few things in it, but I'm going to do my best to read this one out to you here. So how do stream bed pebble counts and other parameters related to hyperhaic zones, GW/SW, I'm not sure if you know what that is referring to,
Yep.
Connectivity appear to affect stream temperature, especially where gaining versus losing sections that appear more strongly perennial than intermittent.
Well,
did you get that one?
Yeah, oh, I'd love to answer that question if I could. Yeah, that's an awesome question. Basically, I think what the asker is referring to is sort of that vertical dimension of interactions, that heat flux in the vertical dimension in streams, as well as the longitudinal upstream, downstream, and there's also a big lateral component too from the hill slope. And yeah, last year we put together a Powell Center proposal, that's USGS's think tank, to try to get some hydrologists and fish ecologists in the room to try to take a look at some of these issues. And so the answer to that question was one of the things we wanted to get at in the hydrologic sense. And There's a lot of great work on sort of that vertical heat flux and how that can be used to determine groundwater influence in streams. There's nothing I'm aware of, and I might have missed some literature, but there's nothing I'm aware of looking at that spatial pattern of gaining and losing, and how that can, in concert with temperature data, can tell you about surface-subsurface flux. And I think that's a great open area of investigation, and maybe one of the reasons we haven't learned a lot there is we haven't had the data that we're starting to collect now to actually check that out. So love that question. Hope to get to it in a couple of years.
Great. I've got two more for you here, so hopefully we can get these both in. Does sedimentation seem to degrade systems, higher temperature, lower microinvertebrate indices, et cetera?
Can you repeat the first part of that? Sorry, missed it.
Yeah, so does sedimentation degrade systems? And the examples were higher temperature or lower microinvertebrate indices.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big, that's in the probably top 2 or 3 sources of water quality impairment in the region. Number 1 is temperature, but sediment's right there, and for that reason, yep.
Okay, great. And then the last one that I have here is any chance that there could be future integration of John Isbicki's use of thermistors and teasing out infiltration rates might provide increased definition of watershed recharge characterization?
Yeah, I'd have to ask who. They're thinking of those vertical thermal arrays to look at heat flux and looking at surface groundwater. I hope I got that right for the asker, but yeah, to me, these networks that we have set up are open door environments where we don't have the resources necessarily to do that kind of stuff ourselves, but there's some neat instrumentation. Ramon Naranjo in the Nevada Water Science Center, USGS, has patented a cool instrument setup for doing that. We'd love to have people come out and do that work in our streams. You can only do that detail work at so many places in the landscape because it takes a lot more effort, but I think doing that in the context of this bigger extent that we're analyzing would be really awesome. I'd love to see it.
Great, thank you. I'm just pulling up a final slide here with our information on the rest of the webinar. There you go. That was our last question here, Jason. So Rick, I'll turn it over to you for a few closing words.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Jason. That was an outstanding presentation, and taking the questions really helped me to better understand the importance of this work. And for those who are still with us, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar. A recording of this presentation will be available on our website later this week. If you have any questions about the LCC or this research, please feel free to contact me or Jason. Our contact information is displayed on the screen. Make sure to join us for a special event on Monday, September 26th at 11:30 a.m. for a presentation by Drs. Gene Chambers of the U.S. Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Steve Hanser from the USGS, who will provide an overview of the science framework for the conservation and restoration of sagebrush strategy under the Department of the Interior Secretary's Order 3336. This is a presentation that we are hosting in partnership with 3 other landscape conservation cooperatives that are within the sagebrush biome. That promises to be a very informative and a current webinar on an issue taking place right here, right now. Also, on Wednesday, October 12th at 10 a.m., there'll be a webinar on the use of archaeological data to plan for greater sage-grouse conservation with Dr. Brian Hockett and Steve Nelson of the Bureau of Land Management. Last but not least, we really want to know what you thought of today's webinar. Please take our short 2-minute survey that will appear on your screen as you log off. Your feedback is really valuable and helps us to plan and improve future webinars. Well, with that, I want to say thank you so much for joining us here today, and look forward to speaking with you next time. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.